there is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a hospital at 2 in the morning. Not silence exactly. Machines still hum. Footsteps still echo down waxed corridors. Somewhere a phone rings and is answered in a hushed voice. But a stillness. The sense of a building holding its breath between one crisis and the next. Diane Kowalski had worked nights for almost 20 years, and she had come to love that particular stillness the way some people love the quiet of early morning before the rest of the house wakes up. She was 56 now, a float nurse at Cedar Ridge Regional, which meant she went wherever she was needed. The ICU on Monday, the emergency department on Tuesday, pediatrics on Wednesday if someone called in sick. Some of the younger staff treated float nurses the way you might treat a substitute teacher. Competent enough, they supposed, but never quite a real part of the team. Never quite someone whose opinion carried the same weight as the nurses who belonged to a single unit, a single family. Diane had made peace with that a long time ago. She had learned over the years that being underestimated had its own quiet advantages. People spoke more freely around you. They forgot to perform for you. And when the moment came, and in a hospital, the moment always eventually came. You were often the only one in the room who had seen enough, in enough different corners of medicine, to know exactly what needed doing. That particular night in early November, the moment came just after 2:15. The overhead radio crackled to life with the particular urgency that made everyone in the department go still. Incoming trauma, multiple casualties, military transport, ETA 6 minutes. The kind of call that didn't come often to a regional hospital like Cedar Ridge, tucked as it was among the Pine Hills 40 miles from the nearest base. But when it did come, it came all at once like weather. Diane was restocking a supply cart in the hallway when the call went out, and she felt the whole department shift around her. Nurses moving faster, doors swinging, the low murmur of preparation rising into something sharper. She didn't rush. She had learned long ago that rushing rarely made anyone faster, only more likely to drop something important. She was still pushing the supply cart toward the trauma bay when the doors blew open and the helicopter's spotlights washed. Blue-white light across the ambulance bay outside, and 6 soldiers came through the doors carrying a 7th on a stretcher between them. The man on the stretcher was young, maybe 28, his leg wrapped in field dressings that had long since soaked through, an oxygen mask fogging with each shallow breath. The soldiers around him moved with the disciplined urgency of men who had carried wounded friends before and hoped never to have to again. At the front of them walked a broad-shouldered man in tactical gear, older than the others, with the quiet, weathered authority of someone who had spent a career being the last person, standing between chaos and order. His eyes swept the room once, quickly, the way Diane imagined a man might scan a battlefield, searching not for who was nearest, but for who actually knew what they were doing. His eyes landed on her. "Beacon," he said. Diane felt the word land strangely, the way an old song might catch you off guard on the radio, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. Around her, the department nurses exchanged confused glances. A young resident named Wesley Hartman, fresh out of his training and still wearing the slightly startled expression of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide his surprise, looked at Diane and then at the soldier and then back at Diane again. "I'm sorry," Diane said, stepping forward, her voice calm in the way it always was, steady as a hand on a rudder. "I think you might have me confused with—" "Diane Kowalski," the man said. "Army Nurse Corps, 2003 to 2009, Forward Surgical Team Kandahar. They called you Beacon because you were the last light some of our men saw before they went under, and the first thing they asked for when they woke up." He didn't smile. Exactly, but something in his face softened. Just slightly, the way stone softens in low evening light. "I was 22 years old and bleeding out on a table in a tent in the middle of nowhere. And you were the one who kept talking to me the whole time so I wouldn't slip away. I never forgot your voice." The room had gone very quiet. Diane felt something rise in her chest. Not quite memory, not quite emotion, but something that lived in the space between the two. A door she had not opened in a very long time, swinging slowly ajar. "Master Sergeant Coleman," she said softly, and the name arrived in her voice like it had never left. You were the one who wouldn't stop talking about your daughter's birthday. Kept telling me you had to make it home for the birthday. She turned 19 last month, Coleman said. Because of you. There was no time in that moment for the kind of long reunion the situation might have deserved in a quieter world. The young man on the stretcher, Coleman's soldier, a corporal named Danny Aldous, was fading fast, his blood pressure dropping, his breathing growing shallow and irregular in the way that Diane's 20 years of experience recognized, immediately as a body running, out of time. Femoral artery, Diane said, already moving, already assessing, her hands finding the wound beneath, the soaked dressing with the same steady competence they had carried across 2 decades and 1 continent's distance. He's lost too much blood. We need to move now, not after we finish the paperwork. The attending physician on duty that night, a capable but relatively junior doctor named Priya Anand, had already begun barking the standard protocol. Full trauma workup. Imaging first standard sequence, the careful, methodical process that worked perfectly. Well, for most emergencies, but cost precious minutes that Danny Aldous did not have. Dr. Anand, Diane said, and there was no challenge in her voice, only the calm clarity of someone who had seen this exact kind of bleeding before, in far worse conditions than a fully equipped American hospital. I've worked forward surgical in combat conditions. This wound needs direct pressure and immediate surgical repair. If we wait for imaging, we lose him. Anand hesitated only a moment. The particular hesitation of a good doctor, weighing pride against evidence, and then nodded. Do it. I'm right behind you. What followed was 40 minutes that would be spoken of quietly, for years afterward, in the break rooms and hallways of Cedar Ridge Regional. Diana Kowalski, the float nurse that some of the younger staff had barely learned the name of, moved through that trauma. Bay, with the calm precision of a woman who had done this work in tents, lit by generator light, under conditions no training manual could fully prepare a person for. She guided Anand through the repair with the quiet authority of someone who had assisted in more field surgeries than most surgeons perform in a decade of stateside practice. She kept Danny Aldous talking, the way she had once kept a 22-year-old. Master Sergeant talking through his own worst hour, her voice a steady thread pulling him back from the dark edge he kept drifting toward. Tell me about home, Danny, she said, her hands never stopping their work. Tell me what you're going back to. Got a dog, he managed, his voice thin and rasping beneath the oxygen mask. Golden retriever. Ridiculous animal. Eats everything that isn't nailed down. What's his name? Biscuit, Danny said, and something like a smile flickered weakly across his pale face. My daughter named him. She's 6. Then you're going to go home and tell Biscuit he's still the worst-behaved dog in the county, Diane said, because your daughter is going to want to hear that story, and you're the only one who can tell it right. She kept him talking through the worst of it, through the moment his blood pressure bottomed out and Anand's hands moved fast and sure to control the bleeding, through the long stretch where the outcome hung uncertain in the sterile air of that trauma bay, and slowly, gradually, the numbers on the monitor began to climb back towards something survivable. By the time they wheeled Danny Aldous into the operating room for the more permanent repair his artery would need, his vitals had stabilized enough that the surgeon on call, glancing at the chart, simply said, "Good work getting him this far," without knowing, quite yet, the full weight of what those words meant. Master Sergeant Coleman found Diane an hour later, sitting on a bench just outside the trauma bay, her scrub still marked with the evidence of the work she'd done, her hands finally still in her lap after 40 minutes of not stopping. He sat down beside her without asking, the way old friends do, though the truth was they had spent perhaps 3 total hours together across the whole span of their acquaintance. 3 hours, 16 years ago, in a tent that smelled of antiseptic and dust. That had apparently been enough to etch her voice permanently into his memory. I looked for you, he said quietly, after I got out. Tried to track down every nurse who'd worked that forward team, just to say thank you properly. Never could find you. You'd gone quiet. I came home in 2009, Diane said. Took a job at a small hospital, kept mostly to myself for a while. Some things you carry with you for a long time before you're ready to talk about them. Coleman nodded slowly. understanding in the particular way that only someone who has carried similar weight can understand. I get that. How did you know I was here? Diane asked. Tonight of all nights? I didn't, Coleman admitted. We just needed the nearest trauma-capable hospital, and Cedar Ridge came up on the map. I walked in expecting a stranger. I did not expect Beacon. He shook his head slightly, something like wonder in the gesture. What are the odds? Diane smiled, a tired, genuine smile, the kind that comes only after hours of hard work that mattered. My grandmother used to say there's no such thing as coincidence, only unfinished stories finding their way back to each other. Word of what had happened moved through Cedar Ridge. Regional the way such stories always do. Quietly at first, in the hushed exchanges of shift change, and then more openly, until by the following week nearly everyone on staff had heard some version of the tale of the float nurse, and the soldier who had crossed an ocean of years to find her again. Wesley Hartman, the young resident who had stood frozen in surprise that first night, sought Diane out a few days later during a quiet stretch on the ICU floor. I have to ask, he said a little sheepishly. All this time I thought you were just filling in, covering shifts nobody else wanted. I had no idea you'd done combat medicine. Diane, checking a patient's chart, with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, glanced up at him with something gentle in her eyes. I didn't advertise it, she said. It's not something I did for the story, Wesley. I did it because people needed help. And I happened to be the one standing there capable of giving it. That's really all nursing ever is, wherever you happen to be doing it. A hospital in the hills, or a tent in the desert. You show up, you pay attention, you do the work. But nobody knew, Wesley pressed, still turning the idea over. You've been floating between units for years. Some people barely learn your name before you're reassigned somewhere else. That's all right, Diane said. And there was no bitterness in it at all, only the calm, settled peace of a woman who had, long ago, stopped needing recognition, to know the value of her own work. The work doesn't need an audience to matter, Wesley. It only needs doing. I learned that a long time ago in a place far from here, from people who never once asked what my job title was before they let me save their lives. Wesley was quiet for a moment, absorbing that the way young people sometimes absorb the wisdom of those who have lived longer, slowly, and with a kind of dawning respect that would stay with him, Diane suspected, for the whole rest of his career. I hope I learn to be half as good as you someday, he said finally. You will, Diane said. Just remember, the ones who float between rooms, who fill in the gaps nobody else wants to fill, who show up quietly and do the unglamorous work without complaint, they're not the ones to overlook, Wesley. More often than not, they're the ones who've seen the most and have the most to teach you, if you're humble enough to ask. Danny Aldous recovered fully over the following months, the artery repair holding strong, his leg healing. Well enough that by spring he was back home, with his daughter and the golden retriever named Biscuit, exactly as Diane had promised him he would be, in that trembling hour when his life had hung by the thinnest of threads. He sent Diane a photograph that April, a little girl with gap-toothed grin sitting on the back of an unruly golden dog, her father kneeling beside them both, laughing at something just outside the camera's frame. On the back, in careful handwriting, Danny had written only, Biscuit says thank you too. Diane kept that photograph in her locker, tucked beside a small collection of others gathered across 2 decades of quiet, unglamorous essential work, proof, if she ever needed reminding, of why she had chosen this life in the first place, and why she would choose it again without hesitation, if given the chance to live it all over. Master Sergeant Coleman retired from active duty 18 months later, and on the day of his retirement ceremony, he made a point of inviting one particular guest, a float nurse from a small regional hospital in the hills, who had once kept a frightened 22-year-old soldier talking through the worst hour of his life, and who, 16 years and one impossible coincidence later, had done exactly the same thing for one of his own men. In his retirement speech, Coleman spoke for a long while about duty and service, and the particular brotherhood of soldiers who have faced fire together. But near the end he paused, found Diane's face in the small crowd gathered beneath the September sun, and said something that would stay with everyone present for a long time afterward. "There's a kind of hero," he said, "who never wears a uniform, never carries a weapon, never asks for a single word of thanks. She just shows up quietly, wherever she's needed, and does the work that keeps the rest of us standing. I was lucky enough to meet mine twice in one lifetime. Not everyone gets that chance. If you're fortunate enough to know someone like that, a nurse, a teacher, a neighbor who shows up without being asked, do yourself a favor. Tell them what they mean to you. Don't wait 16 years in a hospital hallway to do it the way I did." Diane, sitting quietly among the gathered crowd, felt her eyes fill with a warmth she did not try to hide. She thought, as she often did in moments like this, of her grandmother's old kitchen, of quiet lessons learned early about the true measure of a life well lived, not in titles, not in recognition, but in the simple, steady decision, made again and again across the span of a career, to show up for whoever needed showing up for, and to let the work speak for itself. It always did in the end. It always found its way back.